Welcome back, ladies and gents, to your next video lesson. Today we're going to do our first video lesson for our fractions, decimals, and percents unit. It is converting fractions to decimals, and this is video lesson number 6. For today's lesson, you will of course need the notes you were given in class, TOC number 6, and a pencil or pen to take notes, a highlighter marker or colored pencil so you can make some colored notations for yourself. And this lesson is part of the non-calculator section. So put those calculators away, folks, because you can't use them. All right, so with our converting fractions to decimals, we have to focus on long division. I know everybody do the collective, ugh, I don't like it. But when you convert fractions to decimals, you have to use division. So let's review our long division vocabulary. So the dividend is the number that's being divided. It's the one that's going to go inside the division symbols and inside the house, as I call it. The divisor is the number outside the division symbol, or the one that's doing the division. And a fancy word that you're going to hear a lot more now that you're in middle school is quotient. A lot of kids look at that word and say quotient, but it is quotient. And it is a fancy word for the answer or the solution in a division problem. So let's look at this picture that you see down here below. You can see the quotient is the answer, or the number that sits on top of the division symbol. The divisor sits outside on the left of the division symbol, and the dividend, or the number being divided, is on the inside of the division symbol. So go up on your paper on the right hand side, you're going to see a 2 and you're going to see a 16. I want you to ask yourself which one is the divisor and which one is the dividend. The 16 you should have written was the dividend, and the 2 is the divisor, or the number doing the dividing. On the next part, we're going to talk about some fraction vocabulary. Because we are going from fractions to decimals, you have to know and be familiar with those vocabulary words for fractions. So, numerator, of course, we've been talking about this in class with ratios. The numerator is simply the number above the line of the fraction, and the denominator is the number below the line of the fraction. And in division, when we divide fractions to turn them into decimals, the numerator is going to be the dividend, or the number in the house, and the denominator is the number, or the divisor, or the number outside of the house. So if you look down below at the blue divisor and the yellow dividend, think of it this way. The yellow dividend is the numerator, and the blue divisor is the denominator. So the numerator goes inside, the denominator goes outside. So let's look at this example, 4 divided by 2, or 4 over 2. So set up your house. 4 is the numerator, the dividend, so it goes inside the house. The 2 is the denominator, or the divisor, so it goes outside the house. And so we ask ourselves, how many 2's will fit into 4? The answer is 2. And so then we subtract 4 and we get 0. And with all of these problems, these are going to end up with decimal division. So you're never going to have a remainder. You're going to start having decimals, and you want to have a 0 remainder, or a repeating decimal. So let's talk about how we set up our house. So let's look at these examples in the middle of your page. We have 3/5, and so if we were to set that up, the 3 is the numerator. Oops, sorry, simplify first. Some of these fractions you'll notice you can simplify, and they're really big, and we don't want to have to divide by these big numbers. So if you simplify first, it makes your division much easier. So back to 3/5. 3 again is the numerator, so it's going to go inside the house, and 5 is going to go outside the house. Now notice I put a decimal and a 0. And I did that because I know 5 will not go into 3. So I'm going to end up with a decimal answer. So I go ahead and write the numerator with a decimal and 0, so I'm set up to work the problem. Let's look at the next one. We have 14/70ths, which I can divide both 14 and 70, and I can divide them both by 14. And when I do that, I get 1/5. And then when I set up my division problem, 1 is the numerator, it goes inside the house, and 5 is the denominator, it goes outside the house. And again, you'll see that I added that decimal and that 0, so I'm ready to start dividing. 16/56 is also able to be simplified, and this time we're going to divide both by the GCF of 8. And when I divide 16 by 8, I get 2, 56 by 8, and I get 7. And then I set up my division problem with 2 inside the house and 7 outside the house. All right, now let's put everything together. We have for our first sample problem 4/5, and so our first step is to set up our division notation, and then we're going to put our numerator or our dividend into the inner part or inside the house. And I added that decimal point and 0, so it'll be easier for me to get started. 5 is my denominator or my divisor, and it goes outside the division symbol. And then since I know 4 is already smaller than 5 and I'm going to have a decimal, I'm going to bring that decimal point up and put 0 in front just as a placeholder. Now I ask myself, what's the factor that I'm going to multiply times 5 to get to 40? And the answer is 8. You can use your fingers if you need to. 8 times 5 gives you 40. And when I subtract 40 minus 40, of course, I'm going to get 0. Once I get a remainder of 0, I am finished. And so my quotient on this problem is 8/10. And one thing we're going to ask you to do as math students in our classes is that you circle your answer, especially for these problems, because it's going to make it easier for us to locate your final answer because you're going to show a lot of work. On our second practice problem, we have 5/8, and this problem is going to be a little bit longer, so give yourself some room. Set up your division bar. 5 is our dividend, it goes inside the house. 8 is our divisor, it goes outside. And of course, we know we're going to need that decimal point and 0 in front. So now let's ask ourselves, how many times does 8 go into 50? Well, we know 8 times 5 is 40, but if we were to put that in there and subtract, we would get a remainder of 10, which is too big. I can fit another 8 in there. So I'm going to start with 8 times 6. 8 times 6 is 48. Use your multiplication chart to help you if you don't know. When I subtract 50 minus 48, I get 2. And since I have a remainder, I have to add a 0 and bring it down. So now I can divide 20 by 8. And I know that 2 8s will fit into 20 because 8 times 2 is 16. And when I subtract, I get a remainder of 4. So I'm going to add another 0 and bring it down. And then 40, I know from the previous problem, is divisible by 8 and 5. So now 5 times 8 is 40, and I end up with my remainder of 0. So now my final answer is 625 thousandths, and don't forget to circle. For the next problem, we need to simplify first. I can divide both 9 and 12 by 3, and once I do that, I get 3/4 as my new fraction. And the reason why we do this is because it makes it easier for us to divide because the denominator is smaller, and it helps us since we know our smaller factors better. Set up your division bar. 3 goes inside the house, 4 goes outside the house, and we're going to set up that 0 and bring up our decimal point, and now we're ready to go. 4 goes into 30 7 times, because 4 times 7 is 28. That's as close as I can get. Subtract, and you're going to have a remainder of 2. But since I have a remainder, I have to add another 0 and bring it down. Now I can ask myself how many 4s will fit into 20, and the answer is 5, and that will give me 20. So when I subtract, I now have a remainder of 0. So for this answer, 9/12, which simplified as 3/4, gives me a decimal of 75 hundredths. Don't forget to circle. All right, let's continue. Sometimes when you're given fractions, you're going to see mixed numbers. So if that's the case, then we have to convert those mixed numbers into improper fractions before we can do the long division. So just to refresh your memory, when I'm given a mixed number, I like to call it the magic C. You're going to draw a C, and you're going to multiply the denominator times the whole number, and then you're going to add that product or answer to your numerator. So in this example, 2 times 4 is 8 plus 1 gives me 9. And then you just slide your denominator right over, it doesn't change. Once you've used your magic C to get your improper fraction, you use long division to divide the numerator by the denominator. Now it's important to note that when you do these divisions, because you're starting with a mixed number, you will not have that 0 out front. You're going to have a whole number out front. So let's practice converting some more mixed numbers into improper fractions. First, draw the C. Then you're going to multiply 4 times 1 and then add that answer to 3. 4 times 1 is 4 plus 3 gives me 7. And then we're just going to slide the 4 right on over because the denominator does not change. One more practice. Draw your C. 3 times 8 is 24 plus 2 gives me 26, and then we're going to slide that 8 right on over into our denominator. All right, let's do 4 last practice problems, and then we'll be done. Again, we're turning these fractions into decimals using long division. So let's set up our division problems. Get your pencils ready, and let's divide, folks. Set up your division house. The 1 goes inside, the 5 is on the outside. We put our 0 with our decimal point, so we're ready to divide. 5 goes into 10 2 times. 5 times 2 is 10. When I subtract, I get 0, so I know my answer is done. And I end up with 2/10 as my answer. Don't forget to circle. And the next one, we have 3/10, so let's set up our division house. 3 goes inside, 10 goes outside. Set up your 0 with your decimal point, and let's divide. 10 goes into 30 3 times, and that will give us 30. So when we subtract, again, we have a remainder of 0, so we are done, folks. So our answer is 0 3/10. Pause the video if you need a little bit more time. I know I'm going through this pretty fast. Here is 2 mixed numbers that we have to convert. So before we can divide, we have to convert them into improper fractions. Draw your C, multiply, then add. So let's do 2 times 7, which is 14, plus 1 is 15. And we slide that 2 on over. Now we're ready to divide. Set up your division house. We're going to put 15 inside and then 2. Now notice, 2 goes into 15 7 times. Notice that that whole number in front of the decimal point is the same whole number that's in front of the fraction. So that's going to help you out a lot. So you don't have to think on that front end, because you can just think of that whole number out front of the fraction or the mixed number. It's going to be the same whole number that's in front of your decimal. So once I multiply 2 times 7, it's 14. When I subtract, I have a remainder of 1, but I can't stop because I don't have a remainder of 0. So let's bring down our 0 and say how many times will 2 go into 10? That's 5. 2 times 5 is exactly 10. So now I'm done. My answer for 15 halves, or 7 1/2, is 7.5. Some of you may have known that, and that's okay, but it's not going to hurt you to practice on ones that you know to get the process correct. Looking at number 6, we're going to draw our magic C. 5 times 8 is 40, plus 1 gives us 41. Slide that 8 on over for your denominator. Set up your division house. Inside is 41, outside is 8, and we already know from the mixed number that our whole number out front is going to be a 5. When we multiply 8 times 5, we get 40. When we subtract, we have 1 left over. Can't stop there, so we got to bring down a 0. 8 goes into 10 only one time. 8 times 1 is 8. When we subtract, we have 2 left over. Since we still have a number, we got to add a 0 and bring it down. 8 goes into 20 2 times. 8 times 2 is 16. We're going to subtract, and when we subtract, we have 4 left over, but we're still not done. We got to add another 0 and bring it down. 8 goes into 40 5 times. Now when we subtract, we get 0 and we can stop. So on this one, our answer is 5 125 thousandths. And don't forget to circle your answer so you know what your answer is. Now that we're finished, it's time for you to show what you know. Don't forget to log in and take your homework quiz. You will find a link on OneNote just below the link that you followed to go to the video.